February 14th, 1943. Sidi Bou Zid, Tunisia. Obergefreiter Hans Becker crouched behind a knocked-out half-track, watching American infantry advance across the North African desert. He'd been fighting since Poland in 1939. He'd seen the Maginot Line collapse, watched panzers roll across Russia, survived Stalingrad's preliminaries before his transfer to Africa. He thought he knew war. Then he heard it, a sound wrong enough to make every instinct scream. Not the methodical crack-crack-crack of bolt-action rifles he'd grown up with. Not even the faster chatter of the Russian SVT-40 semi-automatics some Red Army units carried. This was something else entirely. 8 shots in rapid succession. Pause. 8 more. Again. Again. The Americans weren't working their bolts between rounds. They were just firing. Becker had been issued the carabiner 98 Kurz 5 years earlier at basic training. It was a magnificent weapon, descended from the legendary Gewehr 98 that German soldiers had carried through the Great War. The action was smooth as silk. The rifle could put rounds on target at 600 meters with iron sights. German armourers had refined Mauser's bolt-action design to near perfection. 5 rounds in an internal magazine, a skilled rifleman could fire 15 aimed shots per minute. The Americans were firing 40, and they kept coming. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This wasn't how warfare was supposed to work. German doctrine, refined over decades, centered on marksmanship and fire discipline. 1 shot, 1 kill. The rifle was a precision instrument. The machine gun provided suppressive fire, while riflemen maneuvered. That division of labor had worked in France. It had worked in Poland. It had even worked, at first, in Russia. But American infantry didn't follow those rules. Every rifleman had the firepower of a light automatic weapon. German squad tactics assumed enemy riflemen would need time to work their bolts, time to take cover while the German machine gunner swept the field, time that suddenly no longer existed. Becker watched one of his squad mates rise to fire. The Wehrmacht soldier got off 1 shot before American return fire forced him down. Not suppressive fire from a machine gun, just rifle fire. A volume of rifle fire that should have been impossible from men armed with shoulder weapons. His squad mate never rose again. The weapon doing this was called the M1 Garand, and it represented something German military theorists had dismissed as wasteful American thinking. The rifle weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded. It fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge from an 8-round en-bloc clip. Most significantly, it was gas-operated and semi-automatic. 1 trigger pull, 1 shot, automatic cycling to chamber the next round. John Cantius Garand had designed it. Born in Quebec in 1888, the same year Hiram Maxim patented the machine gun, Garand had moved to Connecticut as a child. He'd worked in textile mills, shooting galleries, tool shops, self-taught, methodical. By 1919, he was at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, tasked with creating a semi-automatic rifle for the United States military. The project had consumed 17 years. The Army had tested dozens of designs. Garand's first attempts failed. The T1E1's bolt was too weak. He redesigned it. The T1E2 worked better but fired a .276 Pedersen cartridge the Army ultimately rejected. In 1932, Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur personally ordered the project to continue, but only in .30 caliber. The military had millions of rounds of .30-06 ammunition in inventory. Logistics trumped theoretical improvements. Garand went back to the drawing board. Again, he adapted his design to the larger cartridge, modified the gas system, strengthened the operating rod, simplified where possible, refined where necessary. By January 9, 1936, the United States Army standardized the rifle as the U.S. rifle, caliber .30, M1. Production started slowly. Springfield Armory built the first rifles in July 1937. By 1941, when America entered the war, Springfield was producing approximately 600 rifles per day, not nearly enough. Winchester Repeating Arms received contracts for additional production. By 1943, Springfield Armory alone was producing 4,000 rifles daily. Over 4 million M1 Garands would roll off American production lines before war's end. The German military had watched these developments with professional interest and private skepticism. German small arms philosophy prioritized craftsmanship. The Karabiner 98 Kurs was manufactured to exacting tolerances. Each rifle was proof-fired, function-tested, and individually inspected. The bolt action, copied from Paul Mauser's 1898 patent, was considered the pinnacle of rifle design. Strong, reliable, capable of handling high-pressure cartridges. More importantly, the bolt action was economical with ammunition. A conscript with a semi-automatic rifle might panic and burn through his ammunition load in seconds. A rifleman with a bolt-action weapon had to be deliberate. Aim, fire, work the bolt, aim again. This enforced fire discipline, this conserved ammunition. This, German theorists believed, produced better marksmen. The American approach seemed wasteful by comparison. Semi-automatic fire meant soldiers could shoot faster, but faster didn't mean more accurate. And all those extra shots required mountains of ammunition. The logistics alone seemed prohibitive. How would you keep troops supplied with enough cartridges to feed weapons that could empty an 8-round magazine in 4 seconds? The Germans had briefly experimented with semi-automatic rifles. The Gewehr 41 had entered limited production in 1941. The improved Gewehr 43 followed in 1943. Both were reasonably effective weapons, but both remained supplementary arms, issued primarily to designated marksmen and specialists. The Wehrmacht never abandoned the Karabiner 98 Kurz as its primary infantry weapon. Production constraints, reliability concerns, and doctrinal inertia all played roles in that decision. Besides, German strategic planning in 1940 and 1941 assumed short wars. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Rapid mechanized advances, encirclement, capitulation, the kind of warfare where infantry small arms mattered less than armor, aircraft, and operational art. Why invest in expensive new infantry rifles when the next campaign would be over in weeks? Except the campaigns weren't over in weeks. France fell quickly, yes, but Britain didn't capitulate. Operation Barbarossa stalled outside Moscow in December 1941. The Wehrmacht found itself locked in the exact kind of sustained, attritional warfare its doctrine had been designed to avoid. And in that kind of warfare, the infantry rifle mattered a great deal, which brought Obergefreiter Becker to Tunisia in February 1943, watching American soldiers advance with weapons that violated every assumption about how infantry combat was supposed to work. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, fought between February 14th and February 24th, 1943, marked the first major engagement between American ground forces and German troops in the European theatre. The Americans lost, badly. The U.S. Second Corps, under the command of Major General Lloyd Fredendall, suffered over 3,000 casualties and lost substantial equipment. German armour, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, demonstrated the consequences of inexperience meeting veteran troops. But German after-action reports from the battle contained curious notes. American infantry, while tactically green, possessed extraordinary firepower at the squad level. German machine gun positions that should have pinned down entire platoons found themselves suppressed by concentrated rifle fire. American soldiers, when they stood and fought, generated a volume of small arms fire that German infantry couldn't match. The weapon mentioned specifically in several reports was the M1 Garand. Wehrmacht intelligence officers were already familiar with the rifle through pre-war publications and captured examples. What surprised them was seeing it deployed in the hands of every American rifleman, not just specialists. The United States had equipped an entire army with semi-automatic rifles. The logistics tale to support that decision must have been staggering. Yet somehow, the Americans had done it. In terms of pure mechanical accuracy, the Karabiner 98 Kurs and the M1 Garand were roughly comparable. Both rifles, in the hands of skilled marksmen, could consistently hit man-sized targets at 400 to 500 yards. The Kar 98 Kurz fired the 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge, a round with slightly more mass than the American 30-06, but similar ballistic performance. Both cartridges had been developed in the early 20th century and had proven themselves over decades of military use. The Mauser cartridge fired a 196-grain bullet at approximately 2,815 feet per second. The 30-06, in M2 ball specification, fired a 150-grain bullet at approximately 2,740 feet per second. At typical combat ranges under 400 yards, these differences were tactically irrelevant. Both cartridges had sufficient energy to defeat field fortifications and body armor. Both could engage targets effectively, out to the maximum range at which iron-sighted infantry combat occurred. Where the rifles differed fundamentally was in rate of fire and tactical employment. A well-trained German soldier with a Karabiner 98 Kurz could fire 12 to 15 aimed shots per minute. This required working the bolt smoothly between each shot. The action was so refined that skilled riflemen could maintain their sight picture while cycling the bolt, but that still meant a physical interruption between shots. The rifle came off target, the shooter's rhythm broke. Each bolt manipulation cost time. The M1 Garand, by contrast, allowed a rifleman to maintain his firing position and simply pull the trigger. The recoil actuated the operating rod, which extracted the fired case, chambered a fresh round, and cocked the hammer. The shooter never moved his hands, never broke his sight picture, never interrupted his rhythm. A trained American soldier could fire 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute with the M1 Garand. Some soldiers, in sustained combat, reported firing even faster, but raw rate of fire told only part of the story. The real advantage appeared in how the weapon changed infantry tactics. German doctrine built squads around the MG-34 or MG-42 machine gun. The machine gun was the squad's primary weapon. Riflemen existed to protect the machine gunner, carry ammunition, and engage targets the machine gun couldn't effectively address. When a German squad encountered enemy infantry, the machine gunner provided suppressive fire while the rifleman maneuvered. The rifleman then used precise, aimed fire to eliminate specific threats. This system worked brilliantly when facing enemy infantry armed with bolt-action rifles, British soldiers with Lee Enfields, French soldiers with MAS 36s, Russian soldiers with Mosin Nagants. Even the Russian SVT-40 semi-automatic, issued in limited numbers, didn't fundamentally alter the tactical calculus. The German MG-42, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, could suppress entire platoons, while German riflemen maneuvered. American doctrine inverted this relationship. The Browning automatic rifle, the squad's light machine gun, was less capable than the German equivalents. The BAR fired only 500 rounds per minute from a 20-round magazine. It overheated quickly. It was heavy and awkward to shoot from anything but a bipod. By German standards, the BAR was barely adequate as a squad support weapon. But American squads didn't depend on the BAR the way German squads depended on the MG-42. Every American rifleman had a weapon capable of sustained semi-automatic fire. An 8-man American rifle squad, all armed with M1 Garands, could collectively generate 320 to 400 rounds per minute. That volume of fire, distributed across 8 positions instead of 1, was enormously difficult to suppress. When German machine gunners tried to pin down American infantry, they found themselves taking fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Not the deliberate, aimed fire of bolt-action rifles. Not fire that stopped when the enemy took cover and worked their bolts. Continuous, sustained, semi-automatic fire from 8 separate weapons. The tactical implications became clear in Italy during 1944. The mountainous terrain channeled infantry combat into close-range engagements. Machine gun positions that should have dominated entire valleys found themselves unable to suppress American infantry advancing through broken ground. The Americans used covering fire riflemen providing suppression, while other riflemen moved at the squad level. German squads, built around a single machine gun, couldn't replicate this flexibility. Lieutenant Karl Fischer, a Wehrmacht platoon commander in Italy, wrote in his diary about an engagement near Anzio in February 1944. His platoon had established positions on a hillside overlooking an American advance. The MG-42 emplacement had clear fields of fire. Fisher expected to repel the attack with minimal casualties. Instead, his machine gunner was immediately suppressed by concentrated fire from multiple American positions. Fisher ordered his riflemen to provide covering fire, but 6 men with bolt-action rifles couldn't generate enough volume of fire to allow the machine gunner to resume firing. The Americans bounded forward, one fire team providing suppression while another moved. By the time Fisher's platoon withdrew, they'd lost the machine gun and 8 men without inflicting significant American casualties. This scenario repeated throughout the Italian campaign. German defensive positions, strong in theory, proved vulnerable to American fire and movement tactics made possible by semi-automatic rifles. The Americans didn't need superior marksmanship. They needed sufficient accuracy combined with overwhelming volume of fire. And the Americans had ammunition, staggering amounts of ammunition. Each American rifleman carried 80 rounds of 30-06 in combat, 64 rounds in 8 on-block clips in bandoliers, plus a partial clip in the rifle. Supply units maintained forward stockpiles measured in millions of rounds. The logistics system prioritized ammunition delivery. Trucks, trains, ships. The entire American industrial and transportation infrastructure bent toward keeping riflemen supplied. German soldiers, by contrast, typically carried 60 rounds of 7.92 by 57 mm in combat, 4 5-round stripper clips in pouches, plus 5 rounds in the rifle. Resupply was more difficult. German logistics depended heavily on horses and railways. Both were vulnerable to partisan attacks and Allied air interdiction. By late 1943, ammunition shortages were common on the Eastern Front and increasingly frequent in Italy. The difference wasn't just production, capacity. The Americans had built their entire tactical system around abundant ammunition supply. German tactics assumed conservation. American tactics assumed expenditure. Neither approach was inherently superior, but the American system leveraged industrial advantages Germany couldn't match. Springfield Armory at peak production manufactured 4,000 M1 Garands daily, using assembly line methods. The rifles weren't built by master craftsmen, individually fitting parts. They were assembled from interchangeable components by workers with basic mechanical training. Quality control happened through batch testing, not individual inspection. If a production lot met specifications, every rifle in that lot shipped. This mass production philosophy horrified German engineers. Traditional German manufacturing emphasized craftsmanship. Each carabiner, 98 Kurs, received individual attention during production. Tolerances were tight. Fitting was precise. The result was a rifle of exceptional quality. But production rates remained limited by the need for skilled labor. Germany attempted to increase Kar 98 Kurz production through industrial mobilization. By 1943, multiple manufacturers were producing the rifle under license. Mauser, of course, but also Sauer and Sohn, Irma, and others. Quality control standards were relaxed. Less skilled workers, including forced laborers, were employed in production. Output increased, but never matched American levels. More importantly, the Germans never standardized on a single primary infantry weapon the way Americans standardized on the M1 Garand. German infantry units deployed with a mixture of Kar 98 Kurz bolt-action rifles, MP-40 submachine guns, Gewehr 43 semi-automatic rifles, and captured weapons pressed into service. This variety complicated training and logistics. A single American infantry company, by contrast, used the same rifle for every rifleman, simplifying both supply and training. The irony was profound. German military theorists had dismissed the M1 Garand as wasteful, too expensive, too complicated, too dependent on ammunition supply, impractical for sustained combat. Yet by 1944, the rifle had proven itself on every front where American infantry fought. In the Pacific, Marine and Army units used the M1 Garand in jungle warfare from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. The rifle's reliability in tropical conditions exceeded expectations. The semi-automatic action proved particularly valuable in the close-range, high-intensity firefights characteristic of island combat. Japanese infantry, armed primarily with bolt-action Arisaka rifles, found themselves catastrophically outmatched in small arms firepower. In northwest Europe, from Normandy to the Rhine, American infantry with M1 Garands broke through German defensive positions that should have held for weeks. The Siegfried Line fortifications, designed to channel attackers into killing, zones dominated by machine gun fire, proved vulnerable to American infantry tactics that distributed firepower across entire squads rather than concentrating it in crew-served weapons. General George S. Patton, difficult to impress and notoriously critical of military equipment, called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. This from a man who'd spent decades studying military history and weapons. Patton understood that the rifle represented more than just mechanical innovation. It represented a fundamental shift in how industrial democracies waged war. The question German officers asked in 1944 wasn't whether the M1 Garand was effective. Combat had answered that definitively. The question was how the Americans had done it. How had a nation that built automobiles and refrigerators managed to out-engineer German precision manufacturing? How had mass production defeated craftsmanship? The answer lay in a philosophical divide that predated the war by decades. German engineering culture, refined through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, emphasized quality as the path to superiority. Make each item as well as possible. Accept slower production if it meant better products. This approach had served German industry well in markets where reputation and durability mattered. Precision machine tools, optical instruments, cameras, firearms. The phrase German engineering meant something tangible. It meant products built to last by craftsmen who took pride in their work. American manufacturing culture had evolved differently. Henry Ford's assembly line. Frederick Taylor's scientific management. The focus wasn't on individual craftsmanship, but on systematic process. Design products that could be manufactured by workers with limited training. Use interchangeable parts. Standardize everything possible. Accept that individual units might be less refined if the system could produce vastly more of them. Different manufacturing philosophies. They were different worldviews about how industrial societies should function. German weapons designers assumed skilled labor would always be available. When war came, they discovered this assumption was catastrophic. Skilled machinists and armorers were conscripted into combat units. Replacements included forced laborers, concentration camp inmates, and poorly trained civilians. These workers couldn't maintain the tight tolerances traditional German manufacturing required. Quality declined. Production bottlenecks multiplied. By late 1944, German small arms production was plagued by parts that didn't fit properly and weapons that required extensive hand-fitting before they functioned reliably. American weapons designers had built systems that didn't require skilled labor. The M1 Garand was manufactured using drop forging, stamping, and assembly line techniques that any industrial worker could learn in weeks. Parts weren't hand-fitted. They were machined to specifications that ensured interchangeability. A bolt from one rifle would function in any other rifle. A trigger group was a trigger group. Replacement parts arrived in bins, not individually matched sets. This approach seemed crude to German engineers. American tolerances were looser. Surface finishes were rougher. The rifles showed visible tool marks. But they worked. More importantly, they could be produced in quantities that overwhelmed German production capacity. Springfield Armory and Winchester together produced over 4 million M1 Garands during the war. International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson would produce hundreds of thousands more during the Korean War. For comparison, German factories produced approximately 14 million Karabiner 98 Kurz rifles of all variations between 1898 and 1945. That's 47 years of production to reach 14 million units. The Americans produced over 4 million semi-automatic rifles in just 4 years. The difference wasn't just manufacturing technique, it was resource allocation. The United States devoted enormous industrial capacity to small arms production, while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, tanks, and all the other implements of industrial war. Germany, despite starting the war with more developed military infrastructure, couldn't match American production across multiple categories simultaneously. Consider ammunition production. The United States manufactured approximately 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during World War II. 47 billion. That's roughly 16 million rounds for every soldier who served in the U.S. military during the war. The actual figure per frontline rifleman was higher, since much of that production went to training, stockpiling, and supply reserves. German ammunition production figures remain disputed, but estimates suggest approximately 10 billion rounds of small arms ammunition produced between 1939 and 1945, proportionally far less per German soldier, and production increasingly disrupted by Allied bombing, resource shortages, and transportation breakdown after 1943. The Americans built their entire military system on the assumption of abundant supply. German military planners, trained in a tradition of resource scarcity, built systems that emphasized conservation. Neither approach was wrong in isolation, but the American system leveraged advantages Germany couldn't overcome through superior tactics or better training. This brings us to the question implicit in the title of this examination. Did the M1 Garand actually outshoot the Karabiner 98 Kurs at 800 yards? The honest answer is more nuanced than the question suggests. At 800 yards, both rifles were capable of hitting man-sized targets when fired by skilled marksmen under ideal conditions. The ballistics favored neither rifle dramatically. The Mauser 7.92 by 57 mm cartridge had slightly better long-range performance due to its heavier bullet. The 30-06 had marginally flatter trajectory at shorter ranges. At 800 yards, both cartridges had sufficient remaining energy to be lethal. Both suffered similar wind drift and trajectory drop. The difference wasn't mechanical accuracy, it was practical accuracy under combat conditions. A bolt-action rifle firing at 800 yards required the shooter to work the bolt between shots. This broke the sight picture, disrupted breathing rhythm, forced the shooter to reacquire the target for each shot. A skilled marksman could overcome these challenges, but they still existed. A semi-automatic rifle maintained the shooter's position between shots. The recoil disturbed aim. Yes, but the shooter never moved his hands, never broke his cheek weld on the stock. The time between shots was measured in seconds, not the longer intervals required to work a bolt. Follow-up shots came faster. More significantly, American soldiers trained to engage targets at 800 yards weren't individual snipers. They were regular riflemen engaging targets as part of unit fire. Multiple soldiers shooting at the same target. Suppressive fire at ranges that would have seemed impossibly long in previous wars. The M1 Garand made this practical because soldiers could maintain fire without the rhythm-breaking interruption of working a bolt. German snipers with scoped Karabiner 98 Kurz rifles remained formidable at all ranges. The bolt-action platform was actually superior for precision shooting, where maximum accuracy from a single shot mattered more than rate of fire. German snipers scored kills at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards throughout the war. But these were specialists, selected marksmen with months of training and specialized equipment. The revolution the M1 Garand represented was making effective long-range fire accessible to average soldiers, not making every soldier a sniper, making every soldier capable of contributing meaningful fire at ranges where previous generations of infantry would have held their fire as wasteful. Wehrmacht officers who studied captured M1 Garands understood this. Their technical reports, now preserved in archives, show grudging respect for the weapon's design. The gas system was elegant. The en-bloc clip, while unusual, functioned reliably. The rifle was robust enough to withstand field conditions. Several reports recommended developing similar weapons for German service. But by the time these recommendations reached decision-makers, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to retool for mass production of a new rifle. The Gewehr 43, introduced in 1943, was the closest German equivalent to the M1 Garand. It was a competent weapon, but production never exceeded 400,000 units. It remained a supplementary arm, while the Karabiner 98 Kurz remained standard. The Sturmgewehr 44, introduced in 1944, represented Germany's most innovative infantry weapon. Its intermediate cartridge and selective fire capability made it arguably more advanced than the M1 Garand. But production reached only about 450,000 units. Too few, too late. The war's outcome had already been determined by industrial capacity, not weapon innovation. This points to a broader truth about World War II's outcome. Germany entered the war with better trained soldiers, more developed doctrine, and superior tactical execution in the war's early years. But the war wasn't decided by these factors. It was decided by industrial production, logistics, and the ability to sustain combat operations over years of attritional warfare. The M1 Garand symbolized this reality. Not the most technically perfect rifle ever designed, not the most accurate, not even the most advanced by war's end. But good enough. Reliable enough. Producible in quantities that overwhelmed opposition. Supported by a logistics system that kept ammunition flowing to troops who could fire 40 shots per minute instead of 15. Obergefreiter Hans Becker, the German soldier who opened this narrative, survived the war. He surrendered to British forces in May 1945. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, he was asked about American weapons. His response was telling. He said the M1 Garand wasn't a better rifle than the Kar-98 Kurz in any measurable way. But American soldiers had them. All of them. And they had ammunition. Mountains of ammunition. And that made all the difference. The debate about which rifle was better misses the point. The Karabiner 98 Kurz was a masterpiece of bolt-action design. Reliable, accurate, durable. German soldiers used them effectively throughout the war. But individual rifle quality couldn't overcome systemic disadvantages in industrial production, ammunition supply, and tactical doctrine. The M1 Garand wasn't cheap. It cost approximately $85 to manufacture in 1943, equivalent to roughly $1,400 in 2025 currency. The Kar-98 Kurz cost less to produce, though exact figures vary by manufacturer and year. The American rifle was actually more expensive per unit, but expense per unit mattered less than total units produced and the effectiveness of those units in combat. American soldiers in Europe carried weapons that gave them firepower advantages. German infantry couldn't match at the squad level. Not because American rifles were more accurate at long range, not because American soldiers were better marksmen, but because American rifles allowed average soldiers to generate volumes of effective fire that changed what infantry could accomplish tactically. By June 1944, when American forces landed at Normandy, the M1 Garand had become nearly universal among U.S. Army infantry units. The older M1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle remained in use for grenade launching and sniper applications, but the standard rifleman carried the Garand. 250,000 American soldiers came ashore in Normandy that summer, the vast majority armed with semi-automatic rifles. German defenders, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, initially expected to use the same defensive tactics that had bloodied Soviet infantry for 3 years. Establish machine gun positions in depth, force attackers to advance across open ground, use precise rifle fire to pick off targets the machine guns missed. These tactics had worked against Soviet infantry, armed primarily with bolt-action Mosin Nagants and selective-issue Tokarev semi-automatics. They worked less well against American infantry. The Americans used different tactics, fire and movement at the squad level, suppressive fire from multiple positions, rapid exploitation of any gap in German defensive fire. The volume of American small arms fire forced German machine gunners to stay down longer, gave German riflemen less time to engage targets, created tactical opportunities that Soviet tactics hadn't generated. None of this meant American infantry were inherently superior soldiers. German defensive positions in Normandy held for weeks against overwhelming Allied advantages in artillery, air support, and armor. German infantry continued to fight effectively with bolt-action rifles until the war's end. But the tactical calculus had shifted. American infantry had advantages at the squad level that German infantry couldn't match with existing equipment. The question of whether this advantage extended specifically to 800-yard engagements is less important than the broader reality. American infantry could engage effectively at longer ranges than their equipment suggested, not because the M1 Garand was more accurate than the Kar-98 Kurs at extreme range, but because American soldiers could maintain fire at ranges where German soldiers needed to conserve ammunition, could suppress German positions at distances where previous generations of infantry would have closed the range before engaging. German military analysis after Kasserine Pass, after Sicily, after Normandy, consistently noted American firepower advantages at the infantry level, not American tactical superiority, not American soldier quality. Firepower, the ability to deliver more bullets on target in less time. The M1 Garand enabled this advantage. There's a persistent myth that German soldiers would listen for the distinctive ping sound the M1 Garand made when its en-bloc clip ejected after firing the last round. The myth suggests Germans would rush American positions during the few seconds it took to reload. Combat veterans from both sides have largely dismissed this story. The noise of battle artillery, machine, guns, small arms fire from dozens of sources drowned out the relatively quiet clip ejection. More importantly, American soldiers rarely emptied their rifles simultaneously. While one soldier reloaded, others provided covering fire. The myth persists because it provides a comforting narrative. The advanced American rifle had a weakness clever German soldiers could exploit. In reality, the M1 Garand had weaknesses, but they weren't tactical vulnerabilities that changed battlefield outcomes. The rifle couldn't be topped off with individual rounds like a bolt action could. The en-bloc clip system meant soldiers either fired all 8 rounds or manually ejected a partially full clip to reload. This was occasionally inconvenient, but rarely tactically significant. The rifle's real limitations were mechanical. It was heavy, 9.5 pounds empty, over 11 pounds loaded with sling and bayonet. It was long, 43.6 inches overall. It required maintenance. The gas system needed cleaning. The operating rod could bend if subjected to excessive force. But these were limitations of all military rifles, not flaws specific to the Garand. What the M1 Garand proved definitively was that semi-automatic rifles could be issued to every infantryman in an army, not just specialists. This sounds obvious in retrospect, but in 1936, when the rifle was standardized, it wasn't obvious at all. Most military theorists worldwide believed semi-automatic rifles were too complex, too expensive, and too dependent on ammunition supply to be practical as universal issue weapons. The United States proved them wrong, not through superior engineering, though the M1 Garand was well engineered, but through industrial capacity and logistics, the ability to manufacture millions of rifles, the ability to train millions of soldiers to use them, the ability to supply those soldiers with enough ammunition to exploit the rifle's capabilities, the ability to maintain supply lines that kept rifles functioning under combat conditions. Germany attempted similar industrial mobilization, but never achieved comparable results, not due to lack of engineering skill. German weapons designers were among the world's finest, not due to lack of resources, at least initially. Germany controlled most of continental Europe by 1942, but due to strategic decisions, production bottlenecks, Allied bombing, and the grinding reality of multi-front war. By late 1944, German small arms production was in crisis. Ammunition shortages were common. Quality control had collapsed. Forced labourers were sabotaging production when possible. Allied bombing had disrupted transportation networks. The Wehrmacht was increasingly equipped with a hodgepodge of captured weapons alongside standard German arms. American production, by contrast, peaked in late 1943 and remained high through war's end. Springfield Armory never faced labour, shortages. Raw materials flowed uninterrupted. Transportation networks remained intact. The rifles that reached troops in Europe and the Pacific in 1945 were identical in quality to those produced in 1943. This consistency mattered enormously. American soldiers didn't worry about rifle quality. They didn't worry about ammunition supply. They worried about tactics, leadership, and survival. But the mechanical reliability of their weapons was assumed. German soldiers in the war's final year couldn't make that assumption. John Garand never profited financially from his rifle. He transferred all patent rights to the United States government. His salary as a civilian engineer at Springfield Armory was modest. Congress considered granting him a $100,000 payment in recognition of his contribution, but the bill never passed. He received medals, recognition, a place in firearms history, but no royalties from the millions of rifles bearing his name. He remained at Springfield Armory until 1953, when he retired. He helped develop the M14 rifle, which replaced the M1 Garand in 1957. The M14 was essentially a selective-fire M1 Garand, chambered for the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge, with a detachable 20-round magazine. It retained much of Garand's original design philosophy. John Garand died in 1974 at age 86. By then, the M1 Garand had been replaced in U.S. military service by more modern rifles. But the rifle remained in use globally. Surplus Garands had been supplied to dozens of Allied nations: South Korea, Greece, Turkey, Italy, Japan, nations rebuilding after the war, equipped with American weapons as part of Cold War alliance structures. The rifle also became iconic in American culture. Veterans returned home with memories of the weapon that had seen them through combat. The distinctive appearance, the weight, the sound of the en-bloc clip ejecting. For a generation of American men, the M1 Garand was the rifle. Not just a weapon, a symbol of American industrial might and the mechanized warfare that had defeated fascism. In modern historical analysis, the M1 Garand represents a turning point in infantry weapons development. It proved semi-automatic rifles could be practical standard-issue weapons. It demonstrated that firepower could be distributed across entire squads rather than concentrated in crew-served weapons. It showed that industrial production capacity could overcome theoretical limitations in weapon design. The rifle wasn't perfect. The M14, M16, and subsequent American service rifles all improved on aspects of the Garand's design. But the fundamental principle that every infantryman should carry a weapon capable of sustained rapid fire became doctrine for every modern military. That principle traces directly to the success of the M1 Garand in World War II. For German soldiers who faced the weapon in combat, the M1 Garand represented a disturbing truth about the war's trajectory. Germany had entered the conflict with superior training, better tactics, and confidence in its technological superiority. But the Americans had built a military machine that didn't depend on individual excellence. It depended on adequate excellence, multiplied by overwhelming scale. The Americans didn't need the perfect rifle. They needed a rifle good enough to equip millions of soldiers, supported by logistics capable of keeping those soldiers supplied indefinitely. The M1 Garand was that rifle, not the most accurate rifle at 800 yards, not the cheapest to produce, not the lightest to carry, but reliable, effective, and producible in quantities that changed what infantry could accomplish on the battlefield. Obergefreiter Becker, in his post-war interviews, was asked if better German weapons could have changed the war's outcome. He laughed, not bitterly, just with the weary recognition of a man who'd seen the reality of industrial warfare. He said no weapon would have mattered. Germany was fighting the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union simultaneously. Each of those nations had larger populations, more industrial capacity, and greater resource access than Germany. Better rifles wouldn't have overcome those disadvantages. But, he added, if Germany had needed to face American infantry in 1939, when German training and tactical doctrine were at their peak, the outcome might have been different. By the time German soldiers encountered the M1 Garand in quantity in 1943, Germany was already losing the war. The rifle didn't lose Germany the war. but it symbolized why Germany was losing: American industrial capacity, American logistics, American ability to equip entire armies with advanced weapons and keep them supplied through years of sustained combat. The debate about which rifle was superior misses this larger point. In laboratory conditions, the Karabiner, 98 Kurz, and M1 Garand were comparable weapons, both accurate, both reliable, both capable of effective fire at all ranges where iron-sighted infantry combat occurred. But wars aren't fought in laboratories. They're fought by nations mobilizing every resource toward victory. And in that competition, the M1 Garand represented American advantages Germany couldn't overcome. The rifle's nickname among American troops was simple: the Garand. Not an acronym, not a technical designation, just the name of the engineer who'd spent 17 years perfecting it. That simplicity reflected the weapon's place in American military culture. It wasn't exotic, it wasn't temperamental. It was the rifle, the tool you carried, the weapon you cleaned, the thing that worked when you pulled the trigger. For German soldiers, encountering that reliability in American hands was sobering. They'd been told American industry produced inferior products, mass production over quality, quantity over excellence. But the rifle worked, the ammunition arrived, the logistics functioned, and German superiority in small arms, so carefully cultivated through decades of precision manufacturing, proved irrelevant against an enemy who'd simply built more of a weapon that was good enough. That might be the M1 Garand's most important legacy. Not that it was the best rifle of World War II, but that it proved good enough, when produced in sufficient quantity and properly supplied, defeated excellent every time. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.